Sometimes the person you fear most becomes the one who saves you. Sometimes love grows in the darkest places, between two broken souls who never expected to heal. In 9th century Norway, Liv was given to Sten Bearcloak as payment for her village's safety. He's a giant warrior covered in battle scars. She's a terrified woman who flinches at his every move. Every night, he sits at the edge of their bed and whispers the same words. Don't hide from me. He never forces himself on her. He just waits. She sees a monster who destroys everything he touches. He sees a frightened bird he's trying to heal. For months, they live this way, her trembling, him waiting. But slowly, something begins to change. Small kindnesses replace fear. Gentle words replace silence. Then her past returns to destroy them both. What happens when the woman who was afraid to trust must choose to fight? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rough woolen cloak scratched against Liv's shoulders as she pulled it tighter around herself. The coarse fabric a constant reminder of everything that had changed. 3 moons had passed since the marriage ceremony, if it could be called that. More of a transaction, really. A desperate bargain struck by village elders, who saw no other way to save their people from starvation. She remembered that day with painful clarity. The smoke had barely cleared from her burning village when the survivors gathered in what remained of the great hall. Old Gunnar, their chieftain, had spoken in hushed tones with the other elders, while the women and children huddled together, sharing what little food remained. The raiders had taken almost everything, grain stores, livestock, even the fishing nets. Winter was coming, and they had nothing. There is a way, Gunnar had said, his weathered face grave. Sten Bearcloak has made an offer. He will provide for us through the winter grain, meat, protection, in exchange for a bride. The silence that followed felt heavier than the ash that still drifted through the ruined village. Every woman present understood what this meant. Someone would have to sacrifice herself for the survival of the rest. I'll go, Liv had whispered, her voice barely audible. Her younger sister Astrid had clutched her arm. No, Liv, you don't understand what men like can do to. I understand perfectly. Liv had gently removed her sister's grip. And I also understand that we'll all be dead before the first snow if we don't accept. Sten Bearcloak. Even his name struck fear into the hearts of seasoned warriors. She'd heard the stories, how he could cleave a man in two with his massive battle axe, how he'd led raids that left entire settlements in ruins, how his very presence on a battlefield could turn the tide of war. The scars that covered his arms and chest were said to be countless, each one a testament to violence survived and violence dealt. Now, watching him from across their shared dwelling, Liv pulled the marriage cloak closer. The cabin itself was larger than her family's entire home had been, built from solid timber with a stone foundation that spoke of permanence and prosperity. Furs covered every surface. Bear, wolf, seal, and iron tools hung from the walls alongside weapons that gleamed in the firelight. This was the home of a successful warrior, a man who had taken what he wanted from the world through strength and will. And yet, he sat hunched over a piece of wood, carefully carving something with hands that seemed too large for such delicate work. Sten Bearcloak was indeed a giant of a man. Standing, he would tower over most others by a head or more, his shoulders broad enough to fill doorways. His hair, dark as a raven's wing, fell past his shoulders and was often braided with leather cords. The beard that covered his jaw was equally dark, streaked here and there with premature silver from years of battle and hardship. But it was his hands that fascinated and terrified her in equal measure. They were massive, scarred things that could span her entire waist, fingers thick as her wrists. She had watched those hands grip the handle of his battle axe with casual ease, hefting a weapon that would require 2 normal men to lift. Yet now she watched those same hands work with impossible gentleness, coaxing shape from raw wood with patient, precise movements. He had not touched her. Not once in 3 moons. Oh, he had tried in those first days. Gentle attempts to help her with her cloak. Careful offers to tend the fire so she wouldn't have to lean close to the flames. Each time she had flinched away so violently that he had stopped mid-motion, his hands freezing in the air between them. "I will not hurt you," he had said that first night, his voice a low rumble that seemed to emanate from the depths of his chest. "You have my word." The words were just sounds, and Liv had heard plenty of words from raiders before. Sweet promises whispered in her ear as they dragged her sister screaming toward their ships. Gentle reassurances as they put villages to the torch and laughed at the screams of the dying Dot. So each night, she lay rigid beneath the furs while he settled on his side of the great bed they were meant to share. Each night, he would pause at the edge, his weight making the wooden frame creak, and speak those same words. "Don't hide from me." Never a command, never spoken in anger or frustration. Just a quiet request, issued with the patience of a man who had learned to wait for what mattered. The other wives in the village thought she had lost her mind. "Do you know what I would give to have a husband who provides like yours does?" Solveig had whispered to her at the well just yesterday. "Look at you, good wool, silver arm rings, meet every day. And he doesn't beat you?" Liv had pulled her cloak tighter, unable to explain. How could she make them understand that kindness from a man who looked like her nightmares was almost worse than cruelty? At least with cruelty, she knew where she stood. This careful gentleness, this patient waiting, it felt like a trap she couldn't see the edges of. Sten's warriors treated him with a respect that bordered on reverence. She had watched them from the doorway when they came to report or seek counsel. These hard men who had seen their share of blood and battle. They stood straighter in his presence, spoke more carefully, listened to his words as if they carried the weight of prophecy. Jarl, they called him, though she had learned this was not strictly accurate. He held no formal title, ruled no official territory, but his influence stretched far beyond the boundaries of their small settlement. And his word carried weight in disputes that reached across multiple clans. Magnus Ironarm, his closest friend and battle companion, often came to share ale and speak of old campaigns. Liv would listen from her place by the loom, pretending to focus on her weaving while straining to understand this man she was supposed to call husband. "Remember that fight at the river?" Magnus had said just last week, his voice growing animated with drink and memory. 30 of them, maybe more, and you just walked into the middle of it like you were strolling through a meadow. Sten had chuckled, the sound surprisingly warm. They weren't expecting someone stupid enough to fight them alone. Stupid? Magnus had laughed until his belly shook. "Sten, you killed half of them before they knew what was happening. The other half ran like rabbits." These stories should have terrified her more. Instead, Liv found herself listening for details that didn't fit the monster she had imagined, like how Sten always checked on the wounded first after any battle, how he split treasure equally among his men rather than claiming the largest share, how he had once walked away from a perfectly winnable fight because there were children in the village they were meant to raid. "You've gone soft, old friend." Magnus had teased him about this last point. Sten had glanced toward where Liv sat weaving, their eyes meeting for just a moment before she looked away. "Perhaps," he had said quietly, "perhaps that's not such a bad thing." The days had developed a rhythm of careful distance. Sten would rise before dawn to tend his animals and meet with his men. Liv would busy herself with the tasks of keeping house grinding grain, preparing food, mending clothes and gear. They moved around each other like dancers who knew the steps but had never heard the music. Careful never to come close enough to touch, he provided everything she could need. Not just the necessities promised to her village, but small luxuries that spoke of thoughtfulness. Honey for the bread, silver needles that made her sewing easier, Soft furs for the bed that kept the worst of the cold at bay. And always. That battle axe remained stored in the corner, farthest from the bed, wrapped in oilcloth and leather, as if he didn't want to remind her of what he was capable of. But she remembered anyway. Every time she looked at his hands, she remembered other hands. Every time she heard his heavy footsteps, she remembered the sound of raiders crashing through her family's door. Every time he spoke her name in that low, rumbling voice, she remembered screams and smoke and the terrible certainty that she was going to die. "Don't hide from me," he would say each night, settling onto his side of the bed with careful movements that still made the whole structure shift and creak. But how could she explain that hiding was the only thing that had kept her alive? That making herself small and quiet and invisible had been the difference between living and dying when the raiders came? That even now, safe and well-fed and protected by the very kind of man who had once threatened everything she loved, some part of her remained convinced that drawing attention to herself would end in pain. So she pulled the marriage cloak tighter around her shoulders and continued to hide, even as something deep in her chest grew tired of the effort. Even as she found herself wondering what would happen if, just once, she didn't flinch away when those massive, gentle hands reached toward her, even as she began to suspect that the monster she feared and the man who shared her bed might be two entirely different people. The small dagger lay hidden beneath Liv's pillow, its blade no longer than her palm but sharp enough to pierce flesh if needed. She had concealed it there on her wedding night and checked its position each morning since, a secret that felt both shameful and necessary. Today, as she reached beneath the furs to ensure it remained in place, her fingers found only empty space. Panic fluttered in her chest. She threw back the heavy coverings and searched frantically, her heart pounding as she imagined Sten discovering her hidden weapon. What would he do? What would any man do when he realized his wife had been plotting to defend herself against him? Looking for this? His voice came from behind her, gentle as always, but tinged with something she couldn't identify. Liv spun around to find Sten standing in the doorway, her dagger balanced carefully across his open palm. The weapon looked absurdly small against his massive hand, like a child's toy. She began, then stopped. What excuse could she possibly offer? What lie would sound believable? "The leather sheath is cracked," Sten said, stepping into the room with slow, deliberate movements. "I thought I might repair it for you." He held out the dagger, handle first, waiting for her to take it. When she didn't move, paralyzed by confusion and shame, he set it gently on the wooden table that served as her workspace. "You have every right to protect yourself," he said quietly. "I would never take that from you." The kindness in his voice broke something inside her chest. Without warning, tears began streaming down her face, the first she had allowed herself since arriving in his home. The sobs came in harsh, ugly bursts that shook her entire body. Sten took a half step toward her, then stopped when she instinctively recoiled. "Liv, don't." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Don't touch me. Don't." Another sob choked off her words. She sank onto the edge of the bed, clutching her stomach as the tears continued to fall. Every emotion she had buried for 3 moons came pouring out at once: fear, shame, grief, and underneath it all, a bone-deep exhaustion from carrying the weight of her terror alone. Sten remained perfectly still, his massive frame filling her vision but not moving closer. When he spoke again, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "Will you tell me what they did to you?" The question hung in the air between them. Liv wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to regain some measure of composure. She had never spoken of that night to anyone. Not to her sister, not to the village elders, not even to herself in the dark hours when sleep refused to come. "They came at sunset," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. "Just as we were preparing the evening meal. We heard the horns first, then the screaming." She could see it all again with perfect clarity. The way the light from the burning thatch had painted everything in shades of orange and red. The way her mother had shoved her and Astrid toward the root cellar. The way her father had grabbed his old sword with hands that shook with age and fear. Hide, her mother had whispered urgently. Stay hidden no matter what you hear. But Liv hadn't hidden, not completely. She had pressed herself against the cellar wall, where a gap between the stones allowed her to see into the main room. She had watched through that narrow space as the raiders kicked in their door. They were giants, she continued, her voice barely audible. Like you, bearded and scarred and covered in mail that clinked when they moved. They had axes. Her breath caught, and she glanced toward the corner where Sten's own weapon lay wrapped and stored. The similarity was too obvious to ignore. They laughed while they killed my father. Laughed like it was a game. The words tasted bitter on her tongue. One of them grabbed my sister. She fought, screamed for help, and he just... Liv's hands were shaking now, the memories sharp as broken glass. He hit her so hard she stopped moving. Then he dragged her outside with the others. I could hear her crying, begging them to stop. She risked a glance at Sten's face and found it carved from stone. His jaw clenched tight and his dark eyes burning with something that might have been fury. But not at her. She was surprised to realize the anger radiating from him felt protective rather than threatening. I stayed hidden, she whispered, the admission heavy with shame. While they took my sister and killed my parents and burned everything we owned, I stayed hidden like a coward. You survived. Sten's voice was rough with emotion. That's not cowardice. That's wisdom. Is it? Liv laughed bitterly. Astrid was taken because I didn't help her. My parents died because I didn't fight. Everything burned because I did nothing. You were one girl against a war band. What could you have done except die with them? The question should have comforted her, but it only made the pain worse. Maybe dying would have been better than this, living with the memory. Flinching every time I see a man who reminds me of them. She looked at him directly then, meeting his eyes for the first time since her breakdown began. Men who look exactly like you. Sten absorbed this blow without flinching. Though she saw something flicker across his features, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a truth he had suspected, but never heard confirmed. Is that why you keep the dagger? He asked. Because you see them when you look at me? Yes. The word came out as barely a breath. Every night, when you ask me not to hide, I remember hiding in that cellar. I remember the sound of their voices, their laughter. I remember how helpless I felt. She expected him to argue, to defend himself, to explain how he was different. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if her fear made perfect sense. I understand, he said simply, and somehow, she believed he did, moving with infinite care. Sten lowered himself to sit on the floor several feet away from her, making himself smaller and less threatening. What happened to your sister? The question reopened the wound she had tried so hard to close. I don't know. The raiders took her and the other young women. We never know one ever came back. Fresh tears threatened, but she forced them down. That's why I accepted the marriage arrangement. Not just to save the village, but because... She took a shuddering breath. Because I thought if I could prevent other women from suffering what Astrid suffered, then maybe staying hidden in that cellar would mean something. Sten was quiet for a long moment, his massive hands resting motionless on his knees. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had never heard before. I have led raids, he said quietly. Burned villages. Killed men in front of their families. His dark eyes met hers steadily. I have never taken women or children as slaves. I have never allowed my men to do so. But I have done enough that your fear of me is not unreasonable. The admission hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. Part of her wanted to recoil from this confirmation of what she had always suspected. But another part, a smaller, braver part, recognized the cost of his honesty. "Why?" she whispered. "Why tell me this?" "Because I want you to know that I see the difference between fear born from imagination and fear born from experience. Yours has roots in real soil." He paused, searching for words. "And because I want you to know that the man who shares your bed is not the same man who once lived only for war." Liv stared at him, this giant warrior who sat on the floor to make her feel safer, who had returned her hidden weapon without anger, who spoke of his violent past with regret rather than pride. "What changed?" she asked. Sten's gaze moved to the small window where late afternoon light filtered through. "Time. Loss. The realization that breaking things is easier than building them. But building them matters more." He looked back at her, and for the first time, she didn't immediately look away. "Don't hide from me," he said, the familiar words carrying new meaning now that she understood why they mattered to him. "Not because you owe me anything, but because hiding from what frightens us gives it power over us." Liv reached for her dagger, closing her fingers around the familiar grip. The blade no longer felt like her only protection against him. Instead, it felt like a choice, one she could make when she was ready. "I'm not ready," she said quietly. "I know," Sten replied. "I can wait." The wooden comb appeared on her bedside table 3 days after their conversation about the dagger. Carved from pale birch and polished smooth as river stone. Liv discovered it when she woke to find Sten already gone. The space beside her still warm, but empty. She picked up the delicate implement, running her fingers over the intricate knotwork that decorated its spine, interlaced vines and tiny flowers so detailed they seemed to breathe in the morning light. No man she had ever known could carve like this. The work required patience, precision, and an artist's eye for beauty. She thought of Sten's massive hands working the small blade, spending hours on something meant only to please her, and felt something unfamiliar flutter in her chest. When he returned that evening from his duties, she was sitting by the fire with the comb in her lap, her long hair loose around her shoulders. He paused in the doorway when he saw her, something unreadable crossing his features. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. The first words she had spoken to him since revealing her terror 3 days prior. Relief flickered in his dark eyes. "Your hair should be adorned with silver and gold, not tangled from sleep." The compliment was simple, sincere, and it made her cheeks warm in a way she hadn't expected. "I've never owned anything so fine." Sten moved to his usual place across the room, settling into the large chair he had crafted for himself. "Then I should make you more beautiful things." She looked down at the comb, tracing the carved flowers with her fingertip. "When did you learn to work wood like this?" "During the long winters when I was young. My grandfather taught me." His voice carried the warmth it always held when he spoke of family. "He said a man should know how to create as well as destroy, or he becomes nothing but an animal." Liv glanced up at him, studying the scars that marked his arms and hands. Fresh understanding dawned those massive, dangerous hands had spent countless hours learning gentleness, teaching themselves to coax beauty from raw timber. "What else did he teach you?" she asked. Sten's expression softened with memory. How to read the weather in the clouds, which berries could be eaten safely. The old stories about the gods and heroes. He paused, seeming to consider whether to continue. How to treat a woman with honor. The last admission hung between them, weighted with meaning. Liv felt her usual instinct to flee from anything that might lead to deeper intimacy. But the comb in her hands reminded her that this man had spent precious hours thinking of her comfort rather than his own desires. "He sounds like a good man," she said. "He was. He would have liked you." Sten's voice grew quiet. "He always said the strongest women were the ones who survived the worst storms." Liv set the comb carefully on the table beside her chair. "Is that what I am to you? A storm survivor? You're the woman who saved her village by marrying a stranger. The woman who keeps a blade hidden but has never drawn it in anger. The woman who can weave cloth fine enough for a jarl's hall, but chooses to mend my old tunics instead. He met her eyes steadily. You're stronger than you know. The compliment should have pleased her, but instead, it made her uncomfortable. I don't feel strong. I feel, she searched for the right words. Broken. Like something that was dropped and can't be properly mended. I have many scars, Sten said, rolling up his sleeve to reveal the worst of them, a puckered line that ran from wrist to elbow, where an enemy blade had nearly taken his arm. Each one tells a story of surviving something that should have killed me. They don't make me weaker. They prove I endure. Liv stared at the scarred flesh, fascinated despite herself. Does it still hurt? Sometimes. When storms come or when I work too long without rest. He pulled the sleeve back down. But it reminds me that I lived when I should have died. Who gave it to you? A Saxon warrior during a raid on their coast. I was young, too eager to prove myself. I thought speed and fury were enough. Sten's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. He taught me that patience and planning matter more than rage. Liv found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by the story. What happened to him? He lived. I yielded when I realized he had bested me fairly. Sten's expression grew thoughtful. We spoke after, when my wound was tended. He was protecting his family's farm, fighting because he had to rather than because he wanted to. I respected that. You let him live because you respected him. I let him live because killing him would have served no purpose except satisfying my pride. And pride is a poor reason to take a life. This was not the bloodthirsty berserker from the stories. This was a man who had learned hard lessons about the weight of violence, who chose mercy when he could have chosen vengeance. Liv felt another piece of her carefully constructed fear crack and shift. The raiders who came to my village, she said slowly, they killed for sport. They laughed while they did it. Sten's jaw tightened. Then they were animals, not warriors. But you've killed many men. I have. He didn't try to soften the admission. In battle, in defense of my people, sometimes for pay when I was younger and hungrier, but never for pleasure. Never because I enjoyed the act itself. Liv absorbed this distinction, turning it over in her mind. She had assumed all violence was the same, that all warriors were driven by the same cruel impulses. But listening to Sten speak of honor and purpose, she began to understand there might be different kinds of men who chose the sword. Do you regret it? She asked. Sten was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I regret the necessity of it. I regret that the world is built in such a way that good men sometimes must do terrible things to protect what they love. He looked at her directly. But I don't regret surviving long enough to sit in this room with you. The honesty in his voice made her breath catch. There was no false charm in his words, no attempt to seduce or manipulate, just simple truth, offered without expectation of anything in return. Why did you choose me? The question slipped out before she could stop it. I didn't choose you, Sten replied. Your village offered you as part of the bargain. I accepted because they needed help, and He paused, seeming to struggle with his own honesty, because I was tired of being alone. You could have any woman. A jarl's daughter, a wealthy widow. Why accept a marriage to someone who fears you? Sten's smile was sad. Wealthy women want a husband who can give them comfort and status. Jarl's daughters want alliances and political advantage. You needed protection and safety. I thought perhaps we could give each other what we needed most. Liv picked up the comb again, running her thumb over the smooth wood. And what do you need most? To be seen as more than a weapon, he said quietly. To build something instead of destroying it. To matter to someone in a way that has nothing to do with fear. The vulnerability in his admission struck her like a physical blow. This giant, fearsome warrior wanted the same thing she did, to be known and valued for who he was beneath the scars and stories. I see you, she whispered. The words barely audible. Sten's dark eyes met hers across the room. "Do you?" Liv nodded slowly, clutching the beautiful comb he had made for her with such care. "I'm beginning to." The healing herbs grew wild on the slopes behind their dwelling, and Liv had begun venturing out each morning to gather them. Chamomile for calming teas, willow bark for pain, yarrow for wounds remedies her mother had taught her before the world turned to ash and blood. Working with the plants again gave her hands purpose and her mind peace. Something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Today, she knelt beside a patch of meadowsweet, carefully harvesting the delicate white flowers when Sten's shadow fell across her work. She tensed instinctively, but didn't flee a small victory that neither of them acknowledged aloud. "My shoulder troubles me," he said quietly, settling onto a fallen log nearby. "The old break aches when the weather turns." Liv glanced up at him, noting the careful way he held his left arm. "When did it happen?" 3 winters passed. "A warhammer caught me wrong during a battle in the eastern fjords." He rolled the shoulder experimentally, wincing slightly. "The bone healed crooked. Magnus says it makes me look lopsided." Despite herself, Liv felt her mouth twitch toward a smile. "Magnus says many things. That he does." Sten's own smile was warmer than the autumn sun. "Do your herbs help with old injuries?" She nodded, focusing on her gathering to avoid meeting his eyes directly. "Willow bark tea for the pain, and a salve made from comfrey root can ease stiff joints." "Would you?" He stopped himself, and when she looked up, his expression had grown uncertain. "I wouldn't ask you to tend me if it makes you uncomfortable." The offer hung between them, weighted with implications. Touching him, even for healing purposes, would require crossing barriers she had maintained since their wedding night. But studying his face, she saw only genuine need mixed with careful respect for her boundaries. "I could prepare the tea," she said slowly, "and show you how to apply the salve yourself." Relief flickered in his dark eyes. "I would be grateful." They walked back to the dwelling in comfortable silence, Liv's herb basket between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Once inside, she set about preparing the remedies with the focused efficiency her mother had drilled into her. Sten watched from his chair, asking occasional questions about the plants and their properties. "Your mother was a healer?" he asked as Liv ground willow bark with her mortar and pestle. "She knew the old ways. Grandmother taught her, and she taught me." Liv's voice grew soft with memory. "She said a woman who could heal would never be without value, no matter what else the world took from her." Wise words. I thought so too. Until she stopped herself, but Sten's patient silence encouraged her to continue. "Until the raiders came. All my knowledge, all those years of learning, and I couldn't save anyone who mattered." Sten was quiet while she strained the tea and set it aside to cool. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of understanding. "I was trained to fight from the time I could lift a sword. Spent 20 years learning every trick of war, every strategy of battle. But when fever took my first wife, all my skill meant nothing." Liv's hand stilled on the clay pot she was preparing for the salve. "You were married before?" "Briefly." "Astrid." He caught himself. Sigrid was her name. We had barely a year together before the sickness came. The slip of names hung in the air between them. Liv felt something cold settle in her stomach as understanding dawned. "You said Astrid." Sten's face paled slightly. "A mistake. You know about my sister." "It wasn't a question. You knew when you accepted the marriage arrangement that she and I shared the same name." He nodded slowly, understanding there was no point in denying what she had already realized. "Your village elder mentioned it when we negotiated." "Is that why you accepted?" "Because I reminded you of her, both of them?" The basket of herbs fell from her suddenly numb fingers, scattering chamomile across the floor. "No." Sten's voice was firm, urgent. "Liv, no. The name it felt like a sign, perhaps, but it wasn't why I chose to help your people." She backed away from him, the familiar panic rising in her chest. You wanted to replace her. Both of them. I'm just a substitute for dead women. That's not true. Sten rose from his chair but made no move to follow her. Sigrid was sunshine and laughter, quick to smile and quicker to forgive. You are. He struggled for words. You are moonlight and deep water. Quiet strength and hidden depths. You could never be a replacement for anyone, because there has never been anyone like you. The comparison should have comforted her, but all Liv could think about was how thoroughly she had been deceived. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you plan to whisper her name in the dark and pretend I was someone else? I have never spoken another woman's name in your presence, except by accident just now. Sten's voice grew rough with emotion. I have never touched you without permission. I have never expected you to be anything other than exactly who you are. But you hoped, didn't you? Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes. You hoped I would fill the empty space she left behind. Sten was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying her face. When he answered, his honesty cut deeper than any lie could have. Yes, he said quietly. I hoped you might help heal the loneliness. But not by becoming someone else, by letting me know who you are. Liv sank onto the edge of the bed, the weight of revelation pressing down on her. I don't know who I am anymore. The girl who existed before the raid died with her family. What's left is just broken pieces. Then let me help you discover who you're becoming. Sten moved carefully to retrieve the scattered herbs, his large hands gentle with the delicate flowers. Sigrid is gone. Your sister is gone, but we are here, in this moment, and we can choose what to build from the pieces that remain. He set the gathered herbs on the table, then returned to his chair, giving her space while making his presence felt. The tea will help with pain, but healing requires more than herbs. It requires time and patience, and the willingness to believe that broken things can still be beautiful. Liv wiped her eyes, looking at this man who had just admitted to hoping she could ease his grief while somehow making the confession sound like a gift rather than a burden. What if I can't? What if I'm too damaged to be anything but afraid? Then we'll work with the fear until it becomes something else. Sten's smile was sad but determined. I'm a patient man, Liv, and you're stronger than you know. She reached for the cooling tea, wrapping her hands around the warm clay cup. The herbs smelled like home, like her mother's wisdom and the promise that some things could indeed be healed. Show me where it hurts, she said quietly. Sten's eyes widened with surprise, then gratitude. Are you certain? Liv nodded, though her heart hammered against her ribs. We have to start somewhere. The stone hearth had become their evening sanctuary, a place where words came easier and silence felt less like a wall between them. Tonight, flames danced across the carefully laid stones while Liv worked her spindle and Sten repaired a leather harness. Their chairs drawn close enough to share the warmth, but far enough apart to maintain the careful distance they had negotiated. Tell me about your grandfather, Liv said, watching the steady rhythm of his needle through the tough hide. 3 weeks had passed since she had first tended his injured shoulder, and their conversations had grown longer, more personal. Like streams gradually carving deeper channels through stone, Sten's hands paused in their work. Eric Stormcrow. He was a ship captain before age bent his back too much for the sea. Took me in when my parents died of fever. How old were you? 7 winters. His voice carried the matter-of-fact tone of a man long reconciled to early loss. Old enough to remember them, young enough to adapt to his ways. Liv's spindle slowed as she absorbed this. That must have been frightening, losing them so young. It was. But Eric, he had a gift for making difficult things seem manageable. The first night I wept for my mother, he sat beside my bed and told me stories until I fell asleep. He did the same thing every night for nearly a year. The image of a grieving child being comforted by patient storytelling tugged at something tender in Liv's chest. What kind of stories? Sten's needle resumed its steady rhythm. Adventures, mostly. Tales of heroes who faced impossible odds and found ways to win through cleverness rather than strength alone. He said the best warriors were the ones who learned to think before they fought. Is that why you're different from other raiders? The question slipped out before Liv could consider whether it was wise to voice. Different how? She set down her spindle, choosing her words carefully. Magnus tells stories about your battles, but he never speaks of burning villages or taking slaves. The other men respect you, but they don't fear you the way they might a truly cruel leader. Sten was quiet for a moment, firelight playing across his scarred features. Eric taught me that strength without honor is just brutality. That a man who leads through fear alone will always be looking over his shoulder. But you've still done things you regret. Many things. He didn't try to soften the admission. When I was younger, angrier, I thought proving myself meant being more ruthless than anyone else. I participated in raids that served no purpose except enriching the attackers. I followed leaders who cared nothing for honor or mercy. Liv pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. What changed your mind? A village much like yours, actually. Sten's voice grew heavy with memory. We had been hired to recover stolen cattle, but when we arrived, we found families already struggling through a hard winter. Children thin from hunger, old people shivering in drafty halls. He set aside his leatherwork and stared into the flames. The cattle were there, but so were people who would starve if we took the animals away. My war leader at the time said it wasn't our concern. We had been paid to do a job, not to judge the right or wrong of it. But you disagreed. I looked at those children and saw myself at 7 years old, helpless and afraid. I couldn't be the man who made them orphans for the sake of someone else's gold. Liv leaned forward slightly, drawn by the pain in his voice. What did you do? I argued with the leader, tried to convince him we could find another solution. When that failed, I stood between his warriors and the village. Sten's mouth curved in a bitter smile. 15 men against 1. Not the best odds I've ever faced. They fought you? They tried. But something interesting happened. Half of them refused to raise weapons against me. They had been feeling the same doubts I was, but needed someone else to voice them first. The implications of this settled over Liv like dawn breaking across water. That's when you became a leader yourself. That's when I realized leadership isn't about being the strongest or the most feared. It's about being the person others choose to follow because they believe in your choices. Liv studied his profile in the firelight, seeing past the scars and size to the man underneath. Is that why you helped my village? Not for a wife, but because we needed protecting. Sten turned to meet her gaze directly. Your village needed help. I had the means to provide it. The marriage was simply the form the bargain took. And if I had been old or ugly or cruel, then I would have honored the agreement regardless. His voice was steady, certain. A man's word is worth nothing if he only keeps it when circumstances please him. The simple nobility of this statement made Liv's chest tight with emotion. She had spent so many nights fearing this man, convinced he was driven by base desires and selfish impulses. To learn instead that he was governed by principles, that he had risked his life to protect strangers, it shifted something fundamental in how she saw him. I've been unfair to you, she said quietly. You've been protecting yourself. There's nothing unfair about that. But I'd assumed the worst without giving you a chance to prove otherwise. Sten picked up his leatherwork again, but his attention remained on her. Fear based on experience isn't the same as prejudice. You had every reason to be cautious. Did I, though? Liv's voice grew stronger. Or was I so caught up in my own pain that I couldn't see past it? Both can be true. You needed time to heal, and I needed time to earn your trust. There's no shame in either. The firelight caught the silver threads in the shawl Sten had given her, and Liv realized how many small kindnesses he had offered that she had simply accepted without acknowledgement. The repairs to her clothes, the extra furs when winter nights grew cold. the way he always ensured she ate first at meals. "I've taken much and given little in return," she said. "You've given more than you know." Sten's voice was warm. "You've brought life to this place, made it feel like a home instead of just a shelter." "How?" "The herbs drying by the window, the way you hum while you work, the smell of fresh bread instead of whatever I could scrounge from the stores." He gestured toward her spindle. "The sound of your voice in the evenings instead of just my own thoughts for company." Liv felt heat rise in her cheeks at the unexpected poetry in his words. I didn't realize you noticed such things. I notice everything about you." The admission was soft but clear. "The way you checked the locks twice each night. How you saved the best portions of meat for me while taking the smallest for yourself. The little song you sing when you think I'm not listening." The intimacy of being so thoroughly observed should have frightened her, but instead it felt like being seen, truly seen for the first time in months. "What else do you notice?" she asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Sten's smile was gentle. "That you're not hiding from me as much as you used to." The silver arm ring caught the morning light as Sten held it out to her, the metal warm from his hands and gleaming with the soft luster of precious metal worked by skilled craftsmen. Intricate knotwork spiraled around the band, interwoven with tiny ravens and wolves that seemed to move in the shifting light. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice carrying a formality that spoke of ceremony rather than casual gift-giving. "And her grandmother's before that. It has been worn by the women of my family for 5 generations. Liv stared at the beautiful piece, understanding the weight of what he was offering. "Sten, I can't this should go to your daughter, or your son's wife. It should go to my wife." His dark eyes met hers steadily. "To the woman who shares my name and my home, who tends my wounds and listens to my stories by the fire." The title hung between them, heavy with implications they had both been dancing around for weeks. She was his wife-in-law, and in the eyes of their community. But until this moment, the word had felt like a legal fiction rather than an emotional reality. "Are you certain?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have never been more certain of anything." Sten took a careful step closer, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of leather and wood smoke that always clung to his clothes. "You have become precious to me, Liv. Not as a replacement for anyone I've lost, but as yourself. As the woman who brings healing herbs to our home and patience to my troubled sleep." Liv's breath caught. She had not realized he knew about the nightmares that sometimes woke him, or the way she would lie awake listening to ensure he settled back into peaceful rest. "I know about your bad dreams," she admitted. "You call out sometimes, in the old tongue. Words I don't understand, but the pain in them is clear enough." Sten's expression grew surprised, then thoughtful. "I didn't know you were awake for those." "I'm often awake. My own dreams aren't always peaceful." She touched the arm ring with one finger, tracing the delicate metalwork. "What do you dream about?" "Battles, mostly. Men I've killed, friends I've lost. The weight of choices that can't be undone." He was quiet for a moment. "But lately, the dreams have been different. Gentler." "How so?" "I dream of building things instead of destroying them. Of children learning to carve wood by the fire. Of growing old with someone who knows all my stories and still chooses to stay." The words painted a picture so vivid and appealing that Liv felt her heart skip against her ribs. She could see it gray-haired versions of themselves sitting by this same hearth, hands marked by age, but still reaching for each other. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "A peaceful life? With you?" "Yes." Sten's voice carried no hesitation. "I've had enough of war and wandering. I want roots. I want to matter to someone in ways that have nothing to do with how well I swing a sword." Liv looked down at the arm ring, then up at his face, seeing hope warring with uncertainty in his expression. "You matter to me already." Relief flooded his features. "Do I?" Instead of answering with words, Liv extended her arm toward him. "Will you put it on for me?" Sten's hands trembled slightly as he slipped the silver band over her wrist, adjusting it carefully to ensure a comfortable fit. The metal was warm against her skin and heavier than she had expected, a constant reminder of the commitment it represented. "It suits you," he said softly, "as if it was made for your arm alone." Liv turned her wrist, watching the light play across the intricate designs. "Tell me about the women who wore it before me." "My grandmother Thora was a formidable woman. She could navigate by the stars and heal wounds that should have been fatal. She once talked down a war band that came to raid our settlement by challenging their leader to single combat. Did she fight him? She didn't need to. He was so impressed by her courage that he declared her under his protection instead." Sten's smile was fond with memory. She said later that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make your enemy choose not to have one. "And your great-grandmother?" Astrid. He caught himself again, but this time the name of Liv's lost sister didn't sting quite as sharply. Ingrid was a merchant's daughter who convinced her father to trade in amber rather than furs. Made the family wealthy enough to buy land and establish our holdings. Liv noted how he had stumbled over the name again, but instead of anger, she felt a strange sort of compassion. "You still think of her sometimes, my sister." "Sometimes." Sten's honesty was careful but complete. "Not as someone I mourn, but as someone you loved who deserved better than she received. I find myself hoping she found peace somehow, wherever the raiders took her." The admission was so unexpected and kind that Liv felt tears prick at her eyes. "You think of my pain when you remember her. I think of how much you lost, and I wish I could have prevented it. You couldn't have. You weren't there. But men like me were." Sten's voice grew heavy. Warriors who chose cruelty over honor, who took what they wanted without thought for the suffering they caused. Liv reached out without thinking, covering his hand with her own. The contact sent warmth shooting up her arm, but for the first time, it felt safe rather than threatening. "You're not like them," she said firmly. "You could have demanded your rights as a husband from the first night. You could have taken what you wanted and justified it as you do. Instead, you carved me a comb and waited for me to choose to trust you. Any decent man would have done the same." "No." Liv's grip on his hand tightened. Any decent man might have refrained from violence, but not many would have had the patience to heal fear with kindness. Not many would have seen that what I needed most was time to remember that not all strong men are cruel ones. Sten turned his hand over beneath hers, their palms touching for the first time since their wedding ceremony. His skin was warm and calloused from years of work, but his touch was infinitely gentle. "Have you remembered?" he asked quietly. Liv looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. This man who had given her family treasure and personal stories, who had offered protection without demanding payment in fear or submission. "I'm beginning to," she whispered. When he leaned forward slightly, she didn't pull away. When his free hand rose to cup her cheek, she closed her eyes and let herself lean into the warmth of his palm. "Don't hide from me," he murmured against her forehead. This time, she didn't want to. The raven feather arrived with the dawn, black as midnight and bound with a leather cord that bore marks Liv recognized with bone-deep dread. Magnus carried it to their door, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by grim concern as he handed the token to Sten. "A boy brought this before first light," Magnus said, his voice low. "Wouldn't say who sent him, just that it was meant for the Bearcloak's wife." Liv's blood turned to ice water in her veins. The feather was pristine, perfectly preserved, but the leather cord bore the distinctive knotwork of the raiders who had destroyed her. Village's signature as unmistakable as a face. Sten examined the token with growing tension, his warrior's instincts clearly recognizing a threat even if he didn't understand its specific meaning. "Have you seen this before?" "Yes." Liv's voice came out as barely a whisper. She touched the silver arm ring he had given her, drawing strength from its solid weight. The raiders who took my sister, they marked their messages this way. It means they're coming. Magnus swore colorfully. How can you be certain? Because they never leave loose ends. Liv forced herself to think past the panic clawing at her chest. They took Astrid and the other women, but they also took something else. Something my father hid before they arrived. Both men stared at her, waiting. Liv closed her eyes, remembering details she had tried for months to bury. My father was more than a fisherman. Before I was born, he sailed with trading expeditions to the eastern lands, Constantinople, the Silk Road markets. He came back with more than just stories. She opened her eyes, meeting Sten's steady gaze. He had maps. Trade routes through territories most Norsemen have never seen. Locations of markets where silk and spices and silver change hands for enormous profit. Magnus let out a low whistle. That kind of knowledge would be worth a fortune to the right people. More than a fortune. It would give whoever possessed it the power to control trade across half the known world. Liv's hands were shaking now. Before the raid began, I saw him hide something in the old oak tree at the edge of our village. He made me promise never to tell anyone, no matter what happened. Sten's expression had grown dangerously calm, the same stillness she had learned to recognize in him before he made important decisions. And you think these raiders have finally realized what they missed? I think they've spent months torturing the women they took, trying to learn where my father hid his treasures. And I think my sister finally broke and told them. The words hung in the air like a curse. Liv had tried not to imagine what Astrid might have endured in captivity, but now the terrible possibilities crashed over her in waves. Her gentle, laughing sister reduced to a broken thing willing to reveal any secret if it meant a moment's relief from pain. How many of them? Magnus asked, his hand already moving to check his weapons. 30 when they attacked us. Probably more now. Success breeds followers among men like these. Sten was quiet for a long moment, studying the raven feather as if it might reveal hidden secrets. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a battlefield commander. Magnus, send word to the others. I want every able-bodied man armed and ready within the hour. Double a watch on all approaches to the village. What about the women and children? Move them to the strong hall. Post guards, but keep them out of sight. I don't want the raiders to know we're expecting them. Magnus nodded and strode away to carry out his orders, leaving Liv alone with Sten and the weight of her terrible revelation. She expected him to be angry, to demand why she had kept such dangerous knowledge secret. Instead, he simply set the feather aside and reached for her hands. This changes things, he said quietly. Fear gripped her heart. You want me to leave. I want you safe. That's not the same thing. Sten's dark eyes searched her face. These men aren't coming for tribute or treasure alone. They're coming for you, for what you know and what you represent. The final piece of a puzzle they've been trying to solve. Then we give them what they want. Liv's voice grew stronger as desperate resolve took hold. I'll take them to the tree. Let them have the maps. It's not worth dying for. You don't understand. Sten's grip on her hands tightened. Men like these don't leave witnesses. They can't afford to let you live once they have what they came for. You know too much about their plans, their methods. The truth of this settled over her like a burial shroud. She had been naive to think she could bargain with monsters who had already proven they valued nothing beyond their own gain. So what do? She asked. We fight. Sten's voice carried no hesitation. We make them pay such a price for what they want that they wish they had never heard your name. 30 men, maybe more. How many do we have? 15 who can hold a shield wall. A few others too old or young to stand in the front line but useful as archers. The numbers were grim, but Liv had learned to read the expressions that crossed Sten's scarred features. This was not the face of a man preparing to die. It was the face of a strategist calculating odds and possibilities. "You have a plan," she said. "The beginning of one. These raiders are used to attacking defenseless villages, not fortified positions held by prepared warriors. They expect fear and chaos, not organized resistance. But they'll have siege equipment, won't they? Ways to break down walls? Probably. But walls are just one way to defend something precious." Sten's smile was sharp as a blade edge. "And I have advantages they don't know about. Such as? I know this land better than they do. I know which approaches are passable and which are traps. I know where the rivers run deep and where they can be forded." His voice grew thoughtful. "And I know that defending your home makes men fight harder than any amount of gold can motivate them." Liv felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced. Since childhood, the fierce protectiveness that came from having something worth defending. This place had become home in ways she hadn't fully recognized until the threat of losing it arose. "What can I do?" she asked. Sten's eyebrows rose. "I thought you would want to hide until it was over. I've hidden enough." Liv touched the silver arm ring again, drawing strength from its weight and the promises it represented. "These men took my family, destroyed my village, and turned my sister into something broken enough to betray family secrets. I won't hide from them again." "You're not a warrior, Liv. You don't know how to fight." "No, but I know how to heal. I know these lands well enough to move through them without being seen, and I know exactly where my father hid those maps." She met his eyes steadily. "If they want what's mine, they'll have to face me to get it." Sten studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her determination against his protective instincts. Finally, something shifted in his expression, a recognition of the steel that had always existed beneath her gentle exterior. "Very well," he said quietly, "but we do this together. No heroic sacrifices, no running off alone to face them. We stand as one or we fall as one." Liv nodded, feeling the truth of their partnership settle into her bones. Together. Outside, Magnus's voice could be heard calling men to arms, and the peaceful morning they had shared just hours before felt like a memory from another lifetime. But as Sten rose to begin preparations for war, Liv realized she was no longer the terrified girl who had hidden in a root cellar while her world burned. She was a woman with something to protect, someone to stand beside, and a future worth fighting for. The war horn's deep, resonant note carried across the settlement like the voice of an ancient god calling men to judgment. From her position at the edge of the forest, Liv watched as Sten's warriors emerged from their homes with the practiced efficiency of men who had answered such calls many times before. No panic, no confusion, just the grim determination of fighters who knew their trade. 15 against 30, Magnus muttered as he checked the binding on his sword grip. "I've had worse odds." "When?" asked Thorstein, the youngest of Sten's men, his voice tight with nervous energy. "Never, actually, but there's a first time for everything." Magnus's grin was sharp and utterly without fear. Liv marveled at their calm. These men were preparing to face death or victory with the same matter-of-fact acceptance they might bring to any other day's work. But then, she supposed, this was their work protecting what mattered. Standing between safety and chaos, Sten moved among them with quiet authority, checking weapons, adjusting shield positions, offering words of encouragement or tactical reminders. He had donned his battle gear for the first time since their wedding mail shirt that gleamed like silver scales, helmet bearing the raven crest of his clan, and the massive war axe that had earned him his fearsome reputation. Seeing him fully armed was like watching a different man emerge from beneath the gentle husband she had come to know. This was Sten Bearcloak, the warrior, the battle-scarred giant whose name could turn the tide of conflicts. And yet, when he caught sight of her watching him, his expression softened immediately. "You should be with the other women," he said, approaching her position at the tree line. The other women aren't carrying the knowledge these raiders want. Liv adjusted the herb pouch at her belt, filled with supplies for treating wounds. Besides, someone needs to watch the northern approach. You can't cover all directions with 15 men. Lev, I'm not arguing about this again. Her voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. I know these woods better than your men do. I can move through them without being seen, and I can signal if they try to circle around behind you. Sten's jaw tightened, but she could see him recognizing the tactical sense in her proposal. Stay hidden. If they spot you, they won't. I learned to be invisible, remember? The bitter reference to her childhood trauma felt different now, not a source of shame, but a useful skill. Trust me to do my part, and I'll trust you to do yours. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The signal is 3 shorthorn blasts if you see them approaching from the north. 2 long blasts if they're moving to surround us. And if something goes wrong, run. Don't try to help. Don't try to be heroic. Just run toward the coast where Bjorn has a boat waiting. Liv stepped closer, close enough to see her reflection in his dark eyes. What if I don't want to run? What? If I'd rather stay and fight beside my husband? The word husband carried new weight between them, heavy with affection and partnership, rather than legal obligation. Sten's expression grew tender despite the war gear that covered him like iron skin. Then I'd be proud to fall beside my wife, he said quietly. But I'd prefer we both live to grow old together. So would I. She rose on her toes and pressed. A brief, soft kiss to his lips, the first time she had initiated such contact. Come back to me, always. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut their moment short. A scout came galloping into the settlement, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with news. They're coming, he called out, maybe 40 of them following the main road from the east. They'll be here within the hour. 40, not 30. Liv felt her stomach clench, but Sten's expression remained calm. Mounted or on foot? He asked. Mixed. Looks like their leaders are horsed, with foot soldiers following. Good. Horses are a disadvantage in close quarters. Sten turned to address his gathered warriors. You all know the plan. We funnel them into the killing ground between the hall and the smithy. No heroics, no breaking formation. Make them pay for every inch, and trust the men beside you. A chorus of acknowledgments rang out, voices steady despite the odds they faced. Magnus, take 5 men and hold the east barricade. Torstein, 4 men on the west. I'll hold the center with the rest. What about the northern approach? Magnus asked. Covered. Sten's eyes found Liv's. We have a scout who knows the ground. As the men moved to their positions, Liv slipped away into the forest shadows. The woods felt different now than they had during her peaceful herb-gathering expeditions. Every sound was magnified, every movement potentially significant. But her feet found familiar paths, and soon she was settled in a position that gave her a clear view of the northern route. While keeping her hidden among the pine boughs dot from here, she could see most of the settlement spread out below. Sten had chosen the defensive positions narrow passages that would force the raiders to attack in small groups, with overlapping fields of fire for the archers positioned on rooftops. It was the kind of tactical thinking that came from years of experience in warfare. The waiting was the hardest part. Minutes stretched like hours while she strained her ears for any sound of approaching enemies. Below, she could see Sten's warriors in their positions, shields ready and weapons gleaming in the afternoon light. The settlement felt like a drawn bow, taut with potential energy waiting to be released. Then she heard them, the jingle of harness, the low murmur of voices, the creak of leather and mail. They were approaching from the east as expected, but something made her look north toward her own position. Movement among the trees. A flash of color that didn't belong to the forest's natural palette. Liv's blood went cold as she realized what she was seeing. A smaller group, maybe 8 or 10 raiders, was indeed circling around to attack from the north. If they succeeded in reaching the settlement's rear, They could trap Sten's men between two forces and turn a difficult defense into an impossible one. She reached for the horn Sten had given her, then stopped. The signal would warn her husband, but it would also alert the raiders that they had been spotted. They might change their approach, scatter into the woods where they would be harder to track and counter. Unless the idea that formed in her mind was terrifying and foolish and probably suicidal. But it was also the only way she could think of to even the odds for the men she had come to care about. The men who were willing to die defending her, and the knowledge she carried moving with the silence. Her mother had taught her when gathering herbs without disturbing the wildlife. Liv began to descend toward the path the northern raiders would have to take. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady as she opened her herb pouch and began to prepare a mixture her grandmother had once described in hushed tones. A combination that would make a man sleep deeply, assuming she could get them to ingest it. "I won't hide anymore," she whispered to herself, echoing the promise she had made to Sten below. The sounds of the approaching war band grew louder. Soon, the first phase of the battle would begin, and everything they had built together would be tested by fire and blood. But first, she had her own small war to fight. The northern raiders were moving carefully through the trees, and Liv could see their leader now, a man with gray-streaked hair and cruel eyes that reminded her sickeningly of the night her world had burned. They were perhaps 50 yards from the settlement's edge, close enough to launch their surprise attack within minutes. She had one chance to stop them, one opportunity to prove that the frightened girl who had hidden in a root cellar was truly gone, replaced by a woman who would stand and fight for what she loved. Liv checked the small vial of sleeping draught in her hand, said a prayer to whatever gods might be listening, and stepped out of the shadows to face her nightmares. The shield wall formation held like a living thing of iron and determination as the first wave of raiders crashed against it. Sten stood at the center, his massive frame anchoring the line while Magnus and Torstein held the flanks. Their overlapping shields creating an impenetrable barrier that forced the attackers into a grinding, brutal melee. "Hold!" Sten roared as a bearded giant with twin axes tried to break through beside him. His own war axe swept in a devastating arc, catching the raider across the chest and sending him sprawling. Make them earn every step. The sound of battle filled the settlement, the crash of metal on metal, the splintering of wood, the harsh breathing of men fighting for their lives. Blood began to pool in the dirt between the buildings, mixing raiders and defenders in equal measure. From her position in the northern woods, Liv watched the main battle unfold while her own smaller drama played out among the trees. She had intercepted the flanking force just as they prepared to emerge from the forest, stepping into their path with her hands raised and her voice calling out in apparent surrender. "Please," she had cried, letting fear make her voice shake. Not difficult given the circumstances. "Don't hurt me. I have information you want." The raiders' leader, a scarred man named Gunnar Bloodbeard, had studied her with calculating eyes. "You're the one they call the Bearcloak's wife." "I am, and I know where the maps are hidden." This had stopped them cold. Instead of cutting her down immediately, they had gathered around while she spun a desperate tale about wanting to bargain for her life. All the while, she had worked to uncork the vial of sleeping draught, waiting for the right moment. "The trees just ahead," she said now, gesturing toward a massive oak that stood where she claimed her father had hidden his treasures. "But first, we should drink to our bargain." She produced a small flask water mixed with the concentrated herb mixture and offered it to Gunnar as a sign of good faith. "Where I come from, no agreement is binding without sharing drink." The raider chief was suspicious but greedy. The promise of the legendary maps was too valuable to ignore, and what harm could one small woman do? He took the flask and drank deeply before passing it to his men. Thought it would take several minutes for the draft to work. but already she could see some of the raiders beginning to sway slightly on their feet. Soon they would be unconscious, removing the threat to Sten's rear guard. But first, she had to survive the next few minutes. Back at the main battle, Sten's tactical brilliance was becoming apparent. The narrow confines of the settlement prevented the raiders from using their superior numbers effectively. They could only attack a few men at a time, and each attack was met by the coordinated response of warriors who had fought together for years. "Their left flank is weakening," Magnus called out, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead, but his voice strong. "I can push through if you can spare 2 men." "Do it," Sten replied, his axe work never slowing. A raider with a spear tried to thrust at him over the shield wall, but Sten caught the weapon's shaft and yanked the man forward into a Thorstein's waiting blade. The raiders were growing frustrated. This was supposed to have been an easy victory, overwhelm a small settlement with superior numbers and take what they wanted. Instead, they found themselves locked in the kind of grinding, tactical fight that favored disciplined defenders over undisciplined attackers. Their leader, a massive man called Eriksson the Red, began shouting orders to reform their attack. "Where is the northern group? They should have struck by now." In the woods, Liv heard the distant call and knew her deception was working. Half of Gunnar's men were already unconscious, sprawled among the pine needles like children taking afternoon naps. But Gunnar himself was fighting the effects of the drug, his face flushed with effort and growing rage. What did you do?" he snarled, drawing his sword with hands that shook slightly. "What I had to," Liv replied, backing away as the remaining conscious raiders began to realize they had been poisoned. "My husband taught me that sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make your enemy choose not to have one. Treacherous bitch." Gunnar lunged at her with his blade, but his movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. Liv dodged, her heart hammering, and found herself holding her father's old fishing knife. When had she drawn it? But there was no time to wonder. The remaining raiders were converging on her, and even drugged, they were still dangerous. At the main battle, Sten noticed the absence of the expected second assault. His tactical mind quickly grasped what this meant. Somehow, the northern threat had been neutralized. But by whom? A cold certainty settled in his stomach as he realized there was only one person positioned to intercept that flanking force. "Magnus," he called. "Take command. Hold the line." "Where are you going?" But Sten was already moving, fighting his way through the melee, toward the northern woods where his wife faced her own desperate battle against the ghosts of her past. Liv's voice rang clear and strong through the forest as Gunnar, Bloodbeard, advanced on her with murder in his eyes. "I am Liv Erik's daughter of traitors, wife of Sten Bearcloak, and I am not afraid of you anymore." The declaration seemed to surprise the raider chief almost as much as it surprised her. This was not the voice of the cowering girl who had hidden in root cellars. This was the voice of a woman who had found her courage and intended to use it. "You killed my parents," she continued, circling away from his clumsy sword thrusts while the last of his conscious men struggled to stay upright. "You took my sister and broke her until she betrayed family secrets. You burned my world to ash and thought you could return to finish what you started." Gunnar snarled something unintelligible, the sleeping draft making his words slur even as rage kept him moving. He swung his blade in a wide arc that would have taken her head off if it had connected, but Liv was no longer there. "But you made one mistake," she said, her father's fishing knife steady in her hand. "You taught me that hiding isn't enough, that sometimes you have to stand and fight for what matters." Behind Gunnar, the sounds of the main battle were shifting. Sten's tactical superiority was beginning to tell. She could hear the raiders' shouts growing more desperate, their attacks less coordinated. But her own fight was far from over. The raider chief lunged again, and this time his blade caught the edge of her woolen dress, tearing fabric and drawing a thin line of blood across her ribs. Pain flared, but with it came a white-hot fury that burned away the last traces of the frightened girl she used to be. "My turn," Liv hissed, and struck. Her father's knife found the gap between Gunnar's mail shirt and leather belt, sliding between ribs with the precision her mother had taught her when cleaning fish. Not deep enough to kill. She wasn't a murderer, but deep enough to send the poisoned raider to his knees, gasping and clutching at the wound. "The maps," he wheezed. "We're gone," Liv said simply. "Burned years ago when my father realized men like you existed. There never was any treasure to find." Gunnar's eyes widened with the understanding that he had destroyed so many lives chasing something that no longer existed. Then the sleeping draft finally claimed him, and he toppled forward into unconsciousness. Liv stood among the fallen raiders, breathing hard and trying to process what she had just accomplished. 8 men, seasoned fighters who had terrorized settlements across the northern seas, brought low by a woman, with herb knowledge and the courage to use it. The sound of crashing through underbrush announced Sten's arrival. He burst into the small clearing like an avenging god, his war axe dripping with blood from the main battle and his dark eyes wild with concern. "Lev!" He took in the scene at a glance. The unconscious raiders scattered among the trees, his wife standing over their leader with blood on her knife and fire in her eyes. "I'm all right," she said, though her voice shook slightly now that the immediate danger had passed. "They're just sleeping. The draft will wear off in a few hours." Sten moved to her side, his massive hands gentle as they checked her for injuries. The cut on her ribs was shallow, more dramatic-looking than dangerous, but his touch was infinitely careful as he examined it. "You faced them alone," he said, wonder and pride warring in his voice. "I face my fears," Liv corrected. "And won." From the settlement below came the sound of victory cheers from Sten's warriors and the groans of defeated enemies. The main battle was over, decided by superior tactics and the courage of men defending their homes. "How many did we lose?" Liv asked. "None. 3 wounded, including Magnus, but none killed." Sten's smile was fierce with satisfaction. "Your warning about the northern force saved us. Without it, they might have broken our line from behind." Liv looked down at Gunnar's unconscious form, then back at her husband. "What do we do with them?" "The ones who can walk will be given a choice. Leave these waters forever or face trial for their crimes. The wounded will be tended until they can travel, then sent away with the same warning." "And him?" She nudged Gunnar with her toe. Sten's expression grew thoughtful. "He dies, or he lives, your choice. He hurt your family. By rights, his fate belongs to you." Liv considered this, weighing justice against mercy, the past against the future she wanted to build. "He lives, but he goes back to every settlement he's ever raided and makes restitution for the damage he's done. If he refuses, then he answers to me," Sten finished. A fair judgment. As they walked back toward the settlement together, Liv felt the last chains of her old fear falling away. She was no longer the girl who hid from violence. She was the woman who had stood against it and won. Behind them, the northern woods grew quiet except for the soft snoring of poisoned raiders and the whisper of wind through pine boughs. That had witnessed the end of one story, and the beginning of another. Spring came early that year, painting the fjord in shades of green and gold that seemed to promise better days ahead. From her place at the forge, Liv watched Sten work the iron with patient precision, his massive hands shaping the metal as gently as he had once carved her wooden comb. They were making something together, simple iron bands that would replace the silver arm ring and the marriage cloak as symbols of what they meant to each other. "Are you certain about this?" Sten asked, pausing in his work to wipe sweat from his brow. "The ring I gave you is worth 10 times what these will be." "The ring was beautiful," Liv replied, adjusting the bellows to keep the coals at proper heat. "But it belonged to your family's past. These will belong to our future." 6 months had passed since the battle, and the settlement had healed from its wounds with surprising speed. Magnus still bore a scar across his forehead that he claimed made him more attractive to women, though his wife disagreed loudly and frequently. The other wounded had recovered completely, and the victory had brought new families seeking the protection of Sten's leadership. Most importantly, it had brought peace. Word of the raiders' defeat had spread across the northern waters, along with stories of Sten Bearcloak's tactical brilliance and his wife's courage. No other war bands had tested their defenses, and merchant ships had begun stopping at their harbor, drawn by the promise of safe harbor and fair dealing. Liv had played her part in that prosperity. Her healing skills had saved lives during the battle's aftermath, and her knowledge of herbs had proven valuable in treating everything from winter coughs to birthing difficulties. The other women no longer whispered about the Bearcloak's strange wife. Instead, they came to her for remedies and advice, treating her as a respected member of the community. "Tell me about the children again," she said, as Sten resumed his careful hammering. His smile was soft with dreams they had shared during long winter nights. 2, perhaps 3. Old enough to help with the work, but young enough to believe their father's stories about the old gods. "And what will you tell them about how their parents met?" "The truth. That their mother was the bravest woman I ever knew, and that she taught their father how to build something beautiful instead of just destroying things." Liv felt warmth bloom in her chest at the words. The girl who had once flinched from his every movement now looked forward to carrying his children, to teaching them the healing arts while he taught them to work wood and metal with patient hands. "The rings are ready," Sten announced, lifting 2 perfectly matched bands from the cooling water. They gleamed like silver, but were made from honest iron, strong, durable, and forged with their own hands rather than inherited from the past. They walked together to the stone hearth. That had become their sanctuary, the place where their love had grown from fearful tolerance to deep partnership. Outside, the spring evening painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and the sound of children playing drifted through the open windows. "We should speak vows," Liv said as they settled beside the fire. "Real ones, this time. Chosen freely instead of spoken from obligation." Sten nodded, taking her hands in his scarred ones. "You first." Liv looked into his dark eyes, seeing reflected there all the ways they had changed each other. "I, Liv Eriksdotter, choose you, Sten Bearcloak, not because I was given to you or because I needed protection, but because you taught me that love can grow even in the darkest places. Because you showed me that strength without kindness is just cruelty, and that the bravest thing we can do is choose to trust again after we've been broken." She slipped one of the iron bands onto his finger, surprised by how much smaller it looked on his massive hand. "I choose you because you see me, not the frightened girl I was or the woman you thought you wanted, but exactly who I am in this moment. And I promise to stand beside you through whatever storms may come, to build something beautiful with you from the pieces of what we used to be." Sten's voice was rough with emotion when he spoke his own vows. "I, Sten Bearcloak, choose you, Liv Eriksdotter, because you showed me that a man can change if he's willing to do the work. Because you taught me that patience is a form of strength, and that the best victories are the ones won with mercy rather than violence." He placed a second ring on her finger, and she noticed his hands were trembling slightly. "I choose you because you made me want to be worthy of the trust you placed in me. Because you turned a house into a home and a warrior into a man who dreams of growing old beside the woman he loves. And I promise to protect not just your body, but your spirit. To give you space to grow while growing alongside you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire dance and listening to the peaceful sounds of their thriving community. The iron rings felt warm against their skin, solid reminders of choices made freely and promises given without coercion. "No more hiding," Liv said quietly. "No more hiding," Sten agreed as darkness settled over the fjord and the first stars appeared in the clear sky. They remained by their hearth, two people who had found each other across a gulf of fear and pain, who had chosen to build bridges instead of walls, who had learned that sometimes the greatest courage comes not from facing enemies in battle, but from opening your heart to the possibility of healing. Outside, the settlement slept peacefully under the protection of a warrior who had learned to value building over breaking, guided by a woman who had discovered that her voice was stronger than any weapon. And in the morning, there would be new dreams to plan and new hopes to nurture in the rich soil of the life they had planted together.